I don't like thinking about death. It's inconvenient, looks painful, and honestly, it's also kind of rude when you, let's say, get stabbed by someone else. So why is it that it's impossible to not think about it? Death is something that only truly arrives once, yet entire lifetimes are being consumed just dreading that single moment. It shapes our choices, our fears, the way we tell stories. Even as a child, I could feel that dread when I saw the moment Mufasa fights for his life and ultimately loses. And that scream that Simba lets out, I can still hear that in the back of my mind every time I think about mortality. Because whether we fear it or embrace it, an inevitable end to the story is the one fate we all share. The only question across mythologies we have never stopped asking is what happens after death takes you. You know, dying would probably suck. That's why every legend, every myth, every culture has some concept of an afterlife. A way to mitigate the fear of mortality with the prospect of a life beyond death. Because the alternative, the idea that the end is just nothingness, is too grim for most of us to accept. So to solve that minor existential problem, we've created personifications of death and cyclical underworlds to keep dying from feeling arbitrary. And for most of us, that idea is planted early in life, before we're even able to fully grasp what death means. We're introduced to the afterlife through bedtime stories. A grandparent passes away and instead of explaining the permanence of dying, an adult would say, they're in a better place now. It's a comforting idea that's much easier to accept than the other possibilities. Our ancestors are watching over us from the stars. The ones we love never really leave us. Anything that reshapes death from an ending into the next chapter of the story. Not because deep down we don't know what comes next, but because we need there to be a next. Believing there's a place beyond this life unavoidably brings out the question of where that path actually leads. And for a lot of cultures, that unsurprisingly depends on how much you manage to build up your record of offenses in life. Consider for instance Dante's Inferno, a poem from the 14th century with a carefully crafted roadmap of the afterlife, where earthly actions dictate eternal destinations. The journey through the 9 circles of hell presents a structured afterlife where sins are punished in proportion to their severity. Rather than one singular destination, Dante's hell is a descending spiral of 9 distinct circles, each tailored to specific transgressions, from the aimless wanderings of the indecisive to the frozen torment of the ultimate betrayers. Inferno illustrates a concept common across numerous belief systems, that where we go is inextricably linked to who we once were. But by what standard is the weight of one's sins determined? Most of us would say examining ethics, morality, and what it means to deserve a place beyond death.
In the afterlife, there's a good place and there's a bad place.
And obviously, the idea of a good place versus a bad place is the kind of philosophical question that can be argued about for all eternity. But at its core, the concept of an afterlife split into rewards and punishments isn't just about what happens after death. It's implied to be more of a cosmic safety net to ensure that even if someone outruns consequences in life, the universe would supposedly still settle the score in the end. But with different cultures, there are different beliefs shaped by different rules. Some afterlives demand devotion, like the Norse Valhalla, where only those who die in battle are welcomed into Odin's halls, regardless of their morality. Other afterlives don't reward goodness, but instead punish defiance. For example, in Greek mythology, Sisyphus isn't really condemned to eternal suffering because he was evil. He simply refused to accept death. And then there are some afterlives that simply don't care. In Mesopotamian mythology, everyone, good, bad, or otherwise, ends up in the same underworld, a dreary and inescapable existence where even kings become dust. With so many different rules, so many different expectations, you can't help but wonder, what if you pick the wrong one? What if you spend your whole life following one system's path to salvation, only to find out the one you chose to believe in is playing by completely different rules? So, on the opposite end of the spectrum, the Beetlejuice movies have the afterlife inhabited by the spirits and ghosts of those who passed away in the living world, with many of them manifesting in the form they died in. Instead of divine lights or eternal flames, the Beetlejuice afterlife is a different kind of torment in the form of an infinite bureaucratic nightmare. No harps or hellfire, just paperwork and an infinite amount of waiting in lines. To help out newly lifeless arrivals, they are given the handbook for the recently deceased, a vague guide on haunting, afterlife rules, and how to navigate what is basically Dead's version of the DMV. In this depiction, the dead get stuck as civil servants to keep the afterlife running, while others are sentenced to haunt their old homes like some kind of paranormal service order. This idea suggests that the concept of this bureaucratic afterlife, where you are sorted into the appropriate place depending on your paperwork, is less about what happens after we die and more about turning death into something predictable. The same idea is explored in media where bureaucratic afterlives turn grim reapers into office workers, pushing papers and clocking in like everyone else. And while that sounds insane, maybe as a species we're so obsessed with the work ethic, we unconsciously extend the daily grind into our vision of eternity. And perhaps that's why the depiction of a convoluted afterlife is a strangely common one, because even for all its flaws, bureaucracy gives the illusion of control. If death is just another system, then maybe it's not so scary. Maybe with the right paperwork or the right connections, you can negotiate your fate. The concept of another world waiting beyond death is not exactly a modern idea. For over 100,000 years, humanity has tried to imagine what comes next. Some of the earliest evidence of afterlife beliefs comes from prehistoric burial sites, where archaeologists found bodies buried with tools, weapons, and food, suggesting a kind of belief that they would perhaps need these things somewhere else. And from here, the afterlife evolved as societies did. The early hunter-gatherers spent most of their time hunting and gathering. So they envisioned an afterlife where the hunt was always successful and the fruit and nuts were always ripe for the picking. Ancient civilizations then turned the afterlife into more of a structured system, like Egypt, where the heart was weighed against the feather and the worthy would get their passage into paradise. But some cultures imagined death as more of a cycle and less of a destination, a process where the dead weren't lost but recycled, returning to the world in new forms while carrying traces of their past lives with them. This view of existence as a continuum rather than an ending that death doesn't erase but instead reassigns takes on a unique form in the Avatar series. In this universe, the burden of being the Avatar is less about individuality and more about continuity, a soul bound to a perpetual loop of death, rebirth, and responsibility. Each new Avatar isn't just a person, but more like a sequel of all who came before, carrying both their wisdom and their unfinished battles. And I chose the word sequel here because each avatar is building on what came before, carrying the weight of past expectations and hoping to do better. And like any sequel, opinions are divided. If Aang was the original classic, then Korra was the new installment that made some fans very, very loud about how the show just wasn't the same, and it's all her fault. Which, to be fair, is exactly what she went through in-universe. Forever compared to her predecessor. Forever expected to live up to an impossible legacy. And no matter how powerful they are, no matter what the Avatar might accomplish, the cycle will turn again, and every unresolved mistake is inherited by the next vessel. When you break the story down to its core, it sounds kind of crazy for a kids show, but it's actually something you've experienced firsthand. The idea of death and rebirth to finish what was left undone might just be the single biggest driving force in video games. In fact, there's so much death in gaming that at its peak in 2014, 42 Dark Souls 2 characters died every single second. The real world death rate for the same year was around 2 every second, and this was just one game. So perhaps it's not surprising that one genre in particular built its entire experience around death. You know the one I'm talking about. Roguelikes at their core are defined by a few key features, most notably procedural generation, ensuring each playthrough is unique, and permadeath. If, or rather, when you die, your progress is wiped, but you're left with the lessons you learned so that the same thing won't kill you again. Instead of a single linear journey, these games turn existence into a loop where dying because your dad won't let you leave your room is just another step in an endless cycle. That and obviously the fact it's a skill issue. While it might not delve deep into the philosophy of a cyclical afterlife, most games don't exactly dwell on the implications of dying. Failing and respawning is oftentimes nothing more than a game mechanic, so accepting that a character is okay with dying over and over makes sense when they don't exactly seem to notice. But what happens when they do and they're fully aware that they're trapped in an endless loop of death and rebirth? Returnal takes this idea and turns dying into an existential nightmare. Celine, an astronaut trapped in a time loop, constantly relives her own demise while her memories unravel with each cycle. Remembering your own death again and again in some kind of disturbing Groundhog Day would break anyone's psyche, but Returnal makes a bigger statement about death itself. Instead of reincarnation as wisdom, this is reincarnation as a prison, a loop that reinforces the fear that when we die, we lose something essential about ourselves. It's something I've experienced once before, but in a completely different light. In Hades, the protagonist Zagreus tries to escape the underworld and, perhaps more than that, he's trying to escape the weight of his own legacy. As the son of Hades, he's bound to a cycle that existed long before him, a cycle that dictates where he belongs, what he must be, and the fact that no matter how many times he tries to fight his way out, he'll always end up right back at his father's doorstep. Every death resets the loop, but it also pushes the story forward with new dialogue, new interactions, and new layers to the relationship Zagreus has with his immortal family. So instead of being erased, his story builds upon itself, turning his cycle of death into a cycle of growth. And perhaps this existence of a cycle is the problem with legacy. It makes it impossible to outrun, because more than anything, Zagreus is trying to break free from expectations, from a fate written before he was even born. And just like the Avatar inherits the burdens of the past, Zagreus is trapped in a role that refuses to die, even when he does. But what about death is so inherently terrifying? Some might say it's the pain, the idea of a violent accident or slow, inevitable decline. But I think, for many of us, there's a deeper fear we don't always consider. Because beyond the act of dying, we're faced with the prospect that time may ultimately eat away at our existence. It's why so many myths and stories aren't just about what happens after death, but about ensuring we're remembered, about leaving something behind when we no longer have any control over it. In ancient times, the Romans understood just how terrifying being forgotten truly was. So much so that they had a punishment called damnatio memoriae, a systematic erasure where names were chiseled off statues and a person was wiped from history as if they had never existed. And believe it or not, this is the central idea of a certain Disney Pixar film. In 2017's Coco, the concept of a final death is introduced, which is distinctly different from a physical one. In the land of the dead, spirits endure as long as they are remembered by the living, but when the last person in the living world forgets them, there is nothing left to bind them to existence. While the film frames this as a ticking clock, it also presents one of the most interesting portrayals of memory as immortality, where being remembered is the only thing that keeps the spirits alive. And the parallels to damnatio memoriae are undeniably unsettling. The way this afterlife is depicted is less about punishment and more about legacy, even if that is probably because, you know, it's a Disney Pixar film. But perhaps that's where its humanity lies, because what's more terrifying than the thought that one day the world might simply move on without you? I used to feel uneasy about the idea of memorials for the dead when I was younger. Was a photograph or a family heirloom really all that remained of someone who was once alive? And sure, there might be something comforting about physical anchors, objects that insist we were here. But even that assurance feels questionable in the modern age, because the way we leave traces of ourselves has changed in a way that starts to feel a little eerie. This principle that our digital selves linger long after we're gone isn't just some oddity of the internet age. Through constant and increasing engagement with social media, we are slowly forming digital phantoms, echoes preserved in posts and photos that linger long after we're gone. If the internet continues to exist, so will fragments of who we were. And I find myself in the fortunate position of never having faced the digital echo of a birthday reminder for someone who's passed. So I can't say whether that's a gentle comfort or an uncanny specter of grief, but what I can say is that there are ways to frame this in a different kind of light. One of the most deeply human documentaries follows the life of Matt Steen in The Remarkable Life of Evelyn, a World of Warcraft player who passed away from a degenerative disease, leaving behind what seemed like a quiet and isolated life. Every day, Evelyn would log in and run through the forest and town for at least half an hour, experiencing all the things he couldn't do in real life. His parents remarked that their great sorrow was the fact that he would never be able to experience friendship, love, or making a difference in other people's lives.
You proved us wrong. You proved us so wrong.
After his death, his parents discovered that Matt had actually lived an unexpectedly vibrant life in Azeroth, forming deep friendships, creating his own identity, and leaving a lasting influence on the people he met online. I took the time to visit his memorial that was added to World of Warcraft, and I really shouldn't have chopped those onions earlier. One could position the afterlife as nothing more than a comforting fantasy, a concept that is solely designed to smooth the rough edges of mortality. But such a perspective is likely missing the greater whole of why the afterlife persists in nearly every culture. More than just a comfort against fear, it's a framework for storytelling and a way to find purpose in the face of the unknowable. And it is within this framework that the drive for remembrance takes root. If post-existence is uncertain, then legacy becomes the only tangible form of immortality. Beyond just seeking to defeat the bad guy, there's a quest for meaning that endures beyond one's own existence. For warriors that seek immortality through legend, their story cannot end at the grave. If the afterlife is a journey, then death is the doorway. There's a distinct sense of dread at the core of every afterlife story, of a promised paradise with the unspoken assumption that there's something that must come next. Even if it takes the form of punishment or an endless cycle, it is still framed as existence, one that carries on, but in a different place. One simple way to see it is by looking at Joe from the movie Soul, whose life ends abruptly before he has a chance to fulfill his dreams. And instead of moving on, he clings to the idea that his story isn't finished, resisting the natural order with the hope to somehow return to life. As a result of this refusal, his desperate journey through the afterlife is about struggling to accept that his time ran out long ago. Nothing, it seems, is more horrifying than the idea of leaving this world before finding a purpose. But that doesn't consider the possibility that after death there could just be nothing. This is the truth that lingers in the shadows of every afterlife story. The underlying fear that the millions of imagined realms are only there to shield us from the void. Perhaps that's why stories that take place after death are rarely about what actually comes next, instead being framed as reflections of the life that came before. At the heart of every vision of eternity lies the exact same message. What matters most is what is done before the final moment arrives. To better understand the weight of living before the door closes, let's, together, watch the universe explode. Outer Wilds is a game about urgency. Not the anxious kind like you're literally counting down the hours to destruction, but a quieter one. The kind that comes with knowing your time is temporary and every moment matters. And spoilers for the first 22 minutes of gameplay, because that's exactly how long it takes for the universe to supernova and erase all life. But that's the thing. Every road leads to this inevitable end, but it's not about the moment it arrives. The universe might be unraveling, but that doesn't mean you have to spend your final moments panicking. Instead, it's about feeling the warmth of the fire while you roast a marshmallow to gooey perfection. It's about listening to some music with friends. It might be one of the only experiences where existential dread and comforting bliss exist in perfect balance, because in Outer Wilds, the story itself is enough. Meaning is found when you get a chance to look back, in the beautiful moments that linger just before the curtain falls. And I feel like I've stretched the research I'm doing for this video as far as it can go without acknowledging the other way the edge of life is so often imagined, which is not as a place, but as a presence. A figure that both engulfs the lost in darkness, but also guides them there.
I'm your officially assigned guide to the dead worlds. Dead ? Ask me.
And these personifications are as varied as the afterlives they lead to. Sometimes death is a relentless predator, hunting its prey long before their time is up. Other times it's a quiet guide that helps souls understand that their end is already here. And one of my favorite representations is Kindred from League of Legends, who embodied this duality in a strangely perfect way. Having existed as long as mortals have known death, they offer a choice to every soul. Lamb's arrow for a peaceful transition, or Wolf's hunt for those who refuse to let go. One is mercy, the other, inevitability. But at the same time, maybe death isn't always a gentle arrow or dramatic chase. Like in Outer Wilds, more often it's the quiet ending of small, everyday moments, the subtle finales we fail to notice until they're already gone. And for most of Soul, Joe is obsessed with the idea that life must have a singular purpose, a grand reason for existing. But by the end, he comes to the quiet realization that life was never about chasing something greater. It was always about finding meaning in the act of simply living. And maybe that's why the question of what comes after death is never truly answered, because whether there's something beyond or just a void, the only certainty is this life. If eternity awaits, then every action becomes part of a greater story. But if there's only silence, then what's left isn't despair, but a reason to cherish every fleeting second before the curtain falls. Because in the end, the moral behind Afterlife stories has never been about what comes next. It has always been about what's done before the end arrives. As always, thank you for being part of this journey. This time it was more of a literal journey towards and through different afterlives, and I hope you had fun confronting your own mortality. If you're looking for more existential dread or world-building videos, you can help me out by liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell icon to stay up to date. And I'll see you in the next video.